The story began at a moment when the familiar world of the women at its center had already collapsed. The spring of 1944 brought Germany not renewal, but exhaustion and mounting anxiety. City streets were growing emptier, shop windows barer, substitutes for ordinary food filled the tables, and memories of pre-war abundance had turned into a distant tale. In these conditions, a group of young women serving in rear units and auxiliary branches found themselves drawn into the vortex of the global conflict. They were not frontline soldiers, yet they wore uniforms, followed orders, and step by step approached the moment when they would become prisoners of war. Their captivity began not on American soil but in the devastated territories of Western Europe. After the rapid advance of the Allied forces during the spring and summer of 1944, many German units began to retreat, losing communication, supplies, and a sense of direction. Women's auxiliary groups assigned to communications, medical support, and administrative duties were pushed ever closer toward the front line. Transport they relied on never arrived, orders became confused, and roads filled with columns of refugees. In such conditions, falling into captivity became not only a sign of defeat, but also an abrupt end to chaos. When American troops entered yet another town, they found dozens of uniformed women hiding in basements, improvised shelters, and abandoned barracks. The captives expected harsh treatment, humiliation, or retaliation for the destroyed cities of Europe. In wartime thinking, the image of the enemy had been sharpened by years of propaganda on both sides. Yet instead of immediate punishment, they encountered a strict but orderly registration procedure. The women were processed as prisoners of war, although the idea of female POWs still had not fully taken root in public perception. Within days, they were moved with other detainees to a temporary holding area, and then prepared for transport across the ocean. The decision to ship POWs to camps within the United States was tied to security, logistics, and resource considerations. Deep within the American mainland, it was easier to ensure proper guarding, steady supplies, and adherence to international agreements. Women were housed separately, and authorities maintained regulations meant to comply with established norms of treatment. The journey westward lasted weeks. First came an exhausting transfer in overcrowded railcars, where the issued dry rations seemed merely an extension of the familiar wartime scarcity. Then followed a sea crossing filled with tension, the fear of submarine attacks mixing with uncertainty about what awaited them. The women could not imagine that in America they would confront something utterly beyond their expectations, a level of food availability and variety that they had not experienced for years. Their assumptions were shaped by the Germany they had left behind, where bread rations had steadily shrunk, coffee was a watery surrogate, soups were thin, and fats and fresh produce were almost impossible to obtain. When the ship finally reached the American coast, exhaustion and anxiety reached their peak. Yet even the first glimpses of the port contradicted all they had known. They saw busy docks, trucks loaded with goods, and workers' cafeterias serving meals that looked less like wartime rations and more like a simplified version of peacetime abundance. Through the barriers and guards, they saw only fragments, but the contrast with depleted Europe felt almost physical. From the port, the column was transported inland to one of the POW camps. The women's section was separated from the main compound, but operated under the same principles of order, record-keeping, and daily routines. In the first days, food seemed a secondary concern compared to the shock of being on a new continent in a different climate, among those they had been taught to fear. But it was through the daily distribution of meals that they would soon begin to understand the full scale of the differences between the world they had come from and the one in which they now found themselves. After being settled in the camp, constructed according to standard American military designs of the period, the prisoners entered a phase of adaptation that proved no less challenging than the experience of capture itself. The camp was a highly organized system of wooden barracks, fenced perimeters, storage buildings, watchtowers, and administrative offices. It was built to accommodate large groups of prisoners, and although the women's sector was smaller and segregated from the main population, it operated under the same regulations. The daily routine structured every aspect of life: morning, wake-up, roll call, sanitation procedures, meal distribution, and assigned labor within the camp. The treatment of women as prisoners of war followed international agreements that formally guaranteed basic standards of humane conditions. The American authorities were obliged to provide sufficient food, acceptable sanitation, and access to simple recreational activities. For many of the women, these promises seemed abstract, almost suspicious. Years of war had taught them that official assurances rarely matched reality. That is why their first encounter with the camp's food became an event that deeply imprinted itself in their memories. The dining hall, located in a central barrack, was far larger and more equipped than anything the women had seen in recent years. Germany had been steadily tightening food rations since 1942. Traditional dishes had disappeared. Substitutes and diluted versions replaced them. In contrast, the camp's serving lines were filled with trays carrying not just a main dish, but also side items, salads, several types of bread, and portions of fruit that many prisoners had not tasted for months. At first, they believed this abundance was temporary, perhaps a gesture meant only for new arrivals. But as days turned into weeks, the menu remained consistently varied and stable. Particularly striking was the regularity of meat and dairy products. By 1944, meat in Germany was strictly rationed and issued in quantities so small that many households relied primarily on vegetables or grain-based meals. Milk, eggs, and cheese had become scarce. Yet in the American camp, these foods were present in the daily rotation, prepared in large quantities, but still more nutritious than the substitutes the women had grown accustomed to. Fresh fruit, such as apples or oranges, was especially astounding. In Germany, these items had nearly vanished from shops. If they appeared at all, they were considered luxuries. Even so, many prisoners felt an undercurrent of unease. The abrupt change made them wary. They could not understand how a country actively fighting a global war could afford such resources for those it considered enemies. Their knowledge of the American economy was limited. They had no concept of large-scale industrial agriculture or national food programs. All they could do was observe the routine: trays replenished daily, workers handling supplies efficiently, and the complete absence of urgency or scarcity in the kitchen staff's behavior. As weeks passed, the initial shock gradually shifted into a quiet acknowledgement. The food supply was not an illusion or a temporary measure. It was the standard. Despite the Spartan nature of the camp overall, the consistent, balanced meals stood in stark contrast to the near-starvation conditions many had left behind. This contrast became a central theme in their internal reflections, a reminder that the reality of wartime life differed drastically depending on which side of the ocean one lived. The women understood that they were still prisoners, bound by rules and confined within wire fences. But they also sensed that the American system, with its methodical approach to logistics and supplies, allowed for a level of stability that war-torn Europe could no longer provide. The food they received each day was not a privilege, but a byproduct of an organized structure functioning far from the devastation of the front. It was this realization, emerging slowly through daily routines, that began reshaping their understanding of the world beyond the conflict. During the first months in the camp, the novelty of the food slowly gave way to routine, yet it remained the clearest reflection of the contrast between the warring nations. The women, having endured years of restrictions, compared each meal to what they had known in Germany from 1942 to 1,945. They recalled shrinking bread rations, the disappearance of butter, the severe limitation of meat, and the constant reliance on substitutes that damaged both flavor and health. These comparisons arose naturally, for memories of hunger linger long in the mind. The American camp, though far from luxurious, embodied a different reality altogether. The United States, with its vast resources and intact industrial infrastructure, did not suffer the shortages that plagued Europe. The camp's food supply came from military warehouses that received products in large, systematically organized shipments. Deliveries were centralized and reliable, ensuring a consistency that stood in stark contrast to the collapsing logistics of wartime Germany, where bombed railways, damaged roads, and overburdened supply chains made even the simplest distribution unpredictable. For the women, it was not only the presence of food, but its structure that was remarkable. The menu followed guidelines designed to maintain proper caloric intake and nutritional balance. Meals included meat or beans, grains, several types of bread, and both fresh and preserved fruits and vegetables. Certain items, like apples or oranges, carried powerful emotional weight. These fruits had become nearly unattainable in Germany by 1944, and their reappearance here seemed almost unreal. In the camp, however, they were simply part of the standard ration. Over time, the prisoners also noticed how the food was prepared and managed. The camp adhered to strict sanitary regulations. Kitchens were inspected regularly, meal schedules were followed precisely, and there was no shortage of fuel, water, or equipment. The very concept of food waste appeared different here. In Germany, nothing was discarded by the end of the war, while in the camp, leftovers were genuinely thrown away. This simple fact, observed quietly, overwhelmed many of the women, for it symbolized a level of abundance they could scarcely comprehend. The impact of this regular nutrition soon extended beyond mere sustenance. As the women regained weight, strength, and a sense of physical stability, they began to reflect more deeply on the circumstances that had brought them here. Their recovery underscored the collapse of their homeland's supply system. The contrast between their own improving health and the worsening conditions in Germany prompted complicated feelings. Relief at being safe and fed, and guilt at knowing that civilians back home faced growing deprivation. The daily routine in the camp continued to structure their lives. Morning roll calls, light duties such as cleaning, laundry sorting, and general maintenance. These tasks helped maintain order, but never overshadowed the central role played by food in shaping their emotional landscape. Each mealtime acted as a reminder of the war's unequal burdens. Gradually, the prisoners began to see the broader implications behind these differences. The war had long been presented to them as a struggle for survival against a world determined to destroy their nation. Yet here they were, in the custody of one of those supposed enemies, receiving regular meals, sanitation, and conditions that exceeded what many German civilians could expect. Through the simple act of eating, they began to grasp the scale of the economic, social, and logistical disparities between the countries at war. This realization did not lessen the weight of captivity, nor did it erase fears for the future, but it pushed the women toward a deeper understanding of the conflict beyond the front lines. The food they received, varied, steady, and predictable, became a window through which they could see a world radically different from the one they had known. In many ways, it was the first step toward rethinking everything they had been taught before the war brought them here. By the arrival of autumn, a stable routine had taken root in the camp, shaping not only the prisoners' daily activities, but also their internal emotional rhythm. The outward orderliness, strict schedules, regular inspections, and structured tasks contrasted with the women's ongoing worries about home, the war, and the fate of Europe. Although information was limited, occasional official announcements made it clear that the front was approaching Germany itself. Even sparse updates were enough for the prisoners to understand that the conflict was entering a decisive phase. Within this atmosphere of uncertainty, the camp kitchen became a revealing indicator of how systematically the American military operated. On certain days, the women working near the supply areas could observe trucks bringing flour sacks, crates of canned goods, barrels of oil, and frozen meat. The precision of these deliveries impressed them. Supplies arrived on schedule regardless of weather, and storage procedures followed clearly enforced rules. The memories they carried from Germany showed the opposite picture. Warehouses running empty, deliveries disrupted, and the constant attempt to stretch dwindling resources by replacing ingredients with inferior substitutes. The American method of food distribution was built on the principle of sufficient and consistent. This did not imply extravagance, but rather a dependable standard. Even the limited choice between 2 or 3 meal options was something the prisoners found extraordinary, for the very concept of choice had nearly disappeared from their lives in wartime Europe. The stability of the system was the key difference, and this stability became increasingly evident as the weeks passed. They also observed how sanitation was treated not as a courtesy, but as a duty. The camp's hygiene standards were upheld through regular inspections, ready access to water, and strict rules regarding cleanliness in kitchens and living quarters. To the women, this appeared not as an act of goodwill, but as a fundamental part of American military discipline. In Germany, shortages had eroded similar standards, and cleanliness often depended on what could be spared rather than what regulations required. As autumn progressed, the prisoners began to experience a subtle shift in perspective. They reflected on the contrast between the image of Germany they had known, a nation that presented itself as well-organized and resilient under pressure, and the reality of America's functioning war system. Here, despite the scale of the conflict, the infrastructure remained intact, and the regularity of supplies continued uninterrupted. This realization did not evoke admiration so much as a dawning awareness of the disparity between propaganda and lived reality. Emotionally, the women faced an increasing sense of conflict. Their physical condition was steadily improving. Signs of vitamin deficiency faded, their strength returned, and they found themselves healthier than they had been in years. Yet this recovery brought them face to face with troubling thoughts. While they lived safely behind fences, nourished and sheltered, their families at home were undoubtedly facing worsening shortages and air raids. This awareness caused a quiet but persistent unease. In the midst of these changes, camp life continued with its unbroken rhythm. Work assignments, inspections, meal times, and evening rest created a predictable cycle. Yet it was precisely this predictability that intensified the emotional contrast between their current situation and the turmoil beyond the camp. Every new month highlighted how deeply the war had fractured Europe and how far removed the American interior was from such destruction. By late autumn, the camp had become a place where external order clashed with internal tension. The women were safe and physically recovering, but their thoughts increasingly turned to the uncertain path ahead. The war was nearing its turning point, and with each passing day, the prisoners sensed that the structure surrounding them, steady meals, warm barracks, regulated routines, was only a temporary pause in a much larger upheaval. The winter that settled over the camp in early 1945 marked a period when the broader reality of the war became even more apparent. Within the camp's perimeter, order persisted unchanged. Dependable food deliveries, a functioning kitchen, and the steady rhythm of daily routines. Yet the official announcements that occasionally reached the prisoners made one thing unmistakably clear: Germany was losing ground on every front. Even these brief messages were enough for the women to understand that the conflict was approaching its final stage. Throughout this winter, The food they received remained a symbol of stability. For the first time in years, many women faced the cold season without fearing hunger. In Germany, winter had become synonymous with severe shortages. Even families once considered well off had to make do with minimal rations. Potatoes, once a staple, had become scarce. Meat appeared only intermittently, and black bread was the primary source of sustenance for most people. The contrast with the American camp was stark. Here, meals included hot soups, grain dishes, meat or beans, and an array of preserved vegetables, a reliable structure that stood in sharp contrast to the erratic and dwindling supplies in their homeland. One of the most striking differences during the winter months was the availability of heating. The camp barracks were consistently warmed, and inspections ensured that stoves and chimneys remained in working order. Fuel was never rationed in a way that jeopardized the prisoners' well-being. This stood in sharp contrast to life in Germany, where coal was strictly regulated, and many households endured dangerously low indoor temperatures. The warmth of the barracks became another reminder of how differently the two nations experienced the war. Winter also intensified the women's introspection. The season's quietness and confinement gave them more time to think about their lives before the conflict. They recalled the stability and comfort of their pre-war homes, tables without rationing, dependable markets, and a sense of normalcy that now seemed almost distant. These memories created a powerful contrast with the present, especially as they compared their early lives to the hardship now facing Germany. Yet even more difficult was the realization that many of their own families were likely struggling. They imagined the ruined cities, long queues for bread, shortages of fuel, and constant air raids. This sense of helplessness weighed heavily on them. The knowledge that they, as prisoners, were warmer and better fed than their relatives far away was a source of persistent emotional conflict. Despite this inner turmoil, daily routines continued. The women performed assigned tasks, cleaning barracks, organizing supplies, managing laundry, more out of habit than necessity. These responsibilities gave structure to the long winter days. The meals, predictable and nourishing, remained the anchor of their physical recovery. Gradually, they noticed changes in their health. Signs of exhaustion and malnutrition disappeared. Their skin regained color, their strength returned, and chronic ailments lessened. For many, this improvement was almost unsettling, for it emphasized just how dire conditions in Germany must have become. Their own recovery became a mirror against which the decay of their homeland was painfully visible. As winter drew to its end, the camp's atmosphere subtly shifted. The women sensed that they were approaching the final phase of their captivity. Although no dates were given, it was clear that events outside the camp would soon determine their fate. The war was nearing its end, and with that end would come the uncertainties of repatriation. They knew that leaving the camp would not mean returning to the world they once knew. Instead, it meant returning to a devastated country, where survival and rebuilding would define life for years to come. And as the winter slowly loosened its grip, the women braced themselves not for liberation, but for the unknown landscape that awaited them beyond the wire fences. The spring of 1945 unfolded as a period of mounting tension, when the outcome of the war became increasingly clear, even to those far removed from its front lines. Within the camp, routines remained intact, but subtle changes in the behavior of the staff, the tone of official announcements, and the heightened focus on administrative procedures revealed that events outside the fences were rapidly moving toward conclusion. Although the prisoners had no access to newspapers or detailed reports, they sensed the shifting reality through the quiet urgency that settled over the camp. During these weeks, the food long since an established part of their daily life took on a new layer of meaning. It was no longer a matter of astonishment, but a reflection of stability at a time when the outside world was crumbling. As battles approached the heart of Germany, The women could not help comparing their present circumstances with what they imagined their families were enduring. They pictured empty shops, destroyed roads, broken supply lines, widespread malnutrition, and the constant fear brought by air raids. Against this imagined backdrop, the regular meals of the camp seemed less like evidence of abundance and more like a reminder of the deep disparities between the two sides of the conflict. Supply deliveries to the camp continued without interruption. Trucks arrived on schedule, storage facilities remained filled, and the kitchens operated with the same precision as before. Women assigned to tasks near the supply areas observed the well-organized stockpiles of canned goods, grains, and preserved foods. Even the storage methods, designed to prevent spoilage and waste, underscored how meticulously the American military managed its resources. This logistical order stood in sharp contrast to the failing supply systems they remembered from Germany in the final months of the war. As spring progressed, the prisoners noticed changes in their physical condition. Their strength had returned fully, signs of malnutrition had faded, and overall health had improved dramatically. Some who had suffered from chronic conditions felt relief for the first time in years. This physical recovery, however, brought with it emotional complexity. Many struggled with the knowledge that their families and fellow citizens were likely facing hunger and chaos while they themselves lived in relative safety. The paradox of captivity, providing better conditions than freedom in a collapsing homeland, weighed on them heavily. Everyday routines unfolded against this backdrop of emotional conflict. The women performed their assigned chores, attended roll calls, and followed camp regulations as before. Yet each task now felt like part of a countdown. They knew that the end of the war would bring decisions about their repatriation. And while the prospect of returning home carried a sense of hope, it also brought fear. Home, as they remembered it, might no longer exist. By April, the tone of the camp's official announcements shifted again. Messages became shorter but unmistakably pointed. Germany was nearing defeat. Its leadership and infrastructure were collapsing, and large cities were falling one after another. Administrative activity in the camp intensified. Medical examinations were conducted more frequently, records were updated, and the women were instructed to keep their belongings in order. These measures suggested preparation for eventual transport. In this atmosphere, the paradox of their situation became sharper than ever. They were prisoners of war, yet they were sheltered from the devastation that was consuming their country. They were confined by fences, yet they received food, warmth, and stability unavailable to millions of civilians in Germany. This contradiction gave the final weeks of their captivity a somber and contemplative character. As spring approached its end, the women sensed that the decisive moment was near. Their time in the American camp, marked by routine, structure, and the strange comfort of regular meals, was drawing to a close. What awaited them beyond the barbed wire was a world transformed, uncertain, and shaped by loss on a scale none of them had ever imagined. May 1945 marked the moment when events that had long unfolded far beyond the confines of the camp finally reached it. Germany's surrender became an official fact, announced in a restrained and formal manner by the camp administration. The women received the news without outward displays of emotion, yet internally it stirred a complex mixture of reactions. Many felt a quiet sense of relief that the fighting had ended, but this feeling was immediately overshadowed by the realization that their lives would never return to what they had been before the war. Following the announcement, daily routines in the camp changed only slightly. Order was still maintained, but the tension that had characterized the guards and staff for months visibly eased. The administration redirected its efforts toward preparing documentation, updating personal records, and organizing potential transport procedures. While these activities were carried out efficiently, they also signaled that the prisoners were entering a new Phase 1 defined not by the uncertainty of war, but by the uncertainty of what would come after. Food supplies and meal schedules remained completely stable. The kitchens continued to function with the same precision, and the prisoners noticed no reduction in their rations. This consistency contrasted deeply with the fragmentary information they received about conditions in post-surrender Germany. Official notices occasionally mentioned shortages, destroyed infrastructure, humanitarian crises, and the difficulty of supplying civilians with even basic goods. Although such messages were brief, they were enough for the women to grasp that their homeland was in dire circumstances. Thoughts of return now dominated their minds. The idea of going back to Germany, once filled with longing, had become more complicated. The women wondered what awaited them. Ruined cities, unfamiliar authorities, empty streets, or the remains of homes they once knew. They pictured neighborhoods reduced to rubble, families dispersed, and a society struggling to survive amidst destruction. The past, the Germany they remembered, felt increasingly like a distant world that no longer existed. These reflections brought a new form of emotional tension. On the one hand, the prisoners were grateful for the relative stability they experienced in the American camp. On the other hand, this stability amplified their sense of guilt. The knowledge that they were better fed and safer than many civilians back home weighed heavily on them. This became particularly painful for those whose families lived in major cities subjected to intense bombardment. Administrative activity increased as weeks passed. Medical assessments were conducted more frequently. Personal data were reconfirmed, and lists were compiled with growing urgency. Though no clear timeline was given, it was evident that preparations for repatriation were underway. These processes were methodical and bureaucratic, reflecting the camp's overall character: orderly, controlled, and focused on procedure rather than emotion. For many of the women, this period prompted deeper reflection about their wartime experience, their capture, their transport across the ocean, the dramatic contrast between the scarcity they had known in Germany and the organized abundance they encountered in the American camp. All of it now appeared as a sequence of events that revealed broader truths about the war. They understood for the first time that they had witnessed two entirely different systems of organization and resources. They recognized disparities between what they had been told and what they had experienced firsthand. As the first weeks after the surrender passed, time within the camp seemed to slow. The daily routines continued, yet every day carried the awareness that this phase of their lives was nearing an end. The women did not allow themselves to imagine the future too clearly, knowing how unpredictable it remained. But with each passing day, the inevitability of departure grew, and with it, the realization that they would soon return to a homeland transformed beyond recognition. The summer of 1945 became a period in which anticipation gradually gave way to movement toward the inevitable conclusion of the prisoners' time in the camp. After Germany's surrender, the American authorities began preparing for the repatriation of prisoners of war. Yet this process required time, administrative coordination, and cooperation with European agencies. The women understood that each passing day was no longer an extension of uncertainty, but the final phase of their stay in a place that had unexpectedly shaped their wartime experience. The food, which for many months had been stable and sufficient, no longer astonished them but continued to serve as a marker of relative security, a temporary safeguard from the conditions awaiting them in post-war Europe. Occasionally, the camp staff mentioned fragments of information about the situation in Germany: destroyed cities, severe housing shortages, disrupted supply chains, and the deployment of emergency humanitarian programs. These updates were brief and delivered in a neutral tone, yet they conveyed enough to make clear that life ahead would be difficult and fundamentally different from what they had known in captivity. This knowledge deepened the internal conflicts many women felt. They were acutely aware that during their imprisonment, They had recovered physically for the first time in years. Their strength had returned, and many felt healthier than they had since before the war. Yet this improvement brought with it a sense of unease. They knew that their families and fellow citizens back home were facing uncertainty, deprivation, and the immense burden of reconstruction. The idea of returning not to familiar homes, but to ruins weighed heavily on them. Some wondered whether their homes still stood at all. Within the camp, life continued according to established rules. The barracks remained orderly, the kitchen followed its precise schedule, and sanitation routines were maintained with the same discipline as before. The women carried out their daily tasks, now more out of habit than necessity. Meanwhile, the administration gradually loosened restrictions, allowing more freedom of movement within the women's section, while simultaneously preparing for the logistics of departure. Medical examinations became more frequent, and documentation was reviewed and finalized. Each woman's health had to be certified as sufficient for travel, and full identification records had to be completed. There were no abrupt changes, but the sense of approaching departure grew stronger each day. In their free hours, the women increasingly turned to thoughts about the journey ahead. Repatriation no longer symbolized a return to normal life. Instead, it marked the beginning of something unknown. Many feared what they would find or fail to find in Germany. The lack of letters, the destruction of infrastructure, and the chaos following the war created a sense of overwhelming uncertainty. Some women reflected on what their captivity had shown them. The sharp contrast between wartime scarcity in Germany and the organized, stable conditions of the American camp challenged many of their earlier beliefs. They had grown up with the conviction that their own nation possessed unmatched discipline and efficiency. Yet here, in a foreign country once portrayed as hostile, they had experienced a system that remained functional even during war. This recognition did not erase the hardships of captivity, but it left them with a different understanding of the world they would re-enter. When the order finally came for the first group to prepare for departure, the camp grew momentarily tense. The announcement was simple and direct. The women prepared quietly, gathering the few belongings issued to them and receiving basic travel kits for the journey. After months of steadiness, they were now stepping into uncertainty once more. The day of departure arrived under a clear sky. The column of women moved toward the transport vehicles, escorted by guards whose demeanor was formal but no longer severe. As they passed through the camp's gates, many turned their heads to look back at the barracks, the dining hall, the orderly rows of buildings that had provided structure and stability during a chaotic time. In their final glances lay the entire arc of their experience: the shock of arrival, the physical recovery, the emotional turmoil, and the growing awareness of the world outside. The departure was carried out without speeches or ceremony. It was a procedure organized, controlled, and devoid of overt emotion, just like much of their life in the camp. The convoy headed toward the port, from which the prisoners would begin the journey back to a Europe reshaped by destruction and loss. Thus ended a period that had been far more than captivity. It had become an unexpected lesson in contrasts between systems, between realities, and between the world they had known before the war and the world to which they were now returning.